Hello, everyone. This is Mookie Alexander, managing editor over at Field Gulls. It's been a couple of days since the Seattle Seahawks' brutal season opener against the Los Angeles Rams, and it doesn't get any easier with the Detroit Lions coming up next on the road, fresh off a win over the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. It's going to be a raucous crowd at Ford Field. Barry Sanders is getting his statue unveiled, and Seattle may or may not be without both starting offensive tackles, so that's not ideal. So this was going to be a delayed reaction, if you will, look back at the Rams game. But I've decided to turn this into a bit of an emergency mailbag. We've been doing this Q&A over the last couple of months, and those responses have been in written format on the Field Goals website. But this one is the first one in video form. So I've gone through your questions in the Field Goals comments section, and I've highlighted the ones that I'd like to draw attention to and answer. So first and foremost, thanks to everyone who participated, and there will be more of these throughout the year, hopefully not after terrible losses like the one we just witnessed. So let's not waste any time here. Let's go straight to the first question, which comes to us from AJ1978, who says, my question is, has anyone ever asked Pete if he has ever had the desire to run a less predictable defensive scheme? Or another way to pose the question, Pete, do you think teams have an easy time scheming plays to go against the same defense that you have been running forever? All right, so I'm going to push back a little bit on that. The idea that we've been seeing the same defense year after year. Because in the early years of the Legion of Boom days, it was a cover three dominant defense, and you had the personnel to do that. But in recent years, we've seen the Seahawks go to the 3-4 hybrid look. They've been running less cover three. They've been going to the more split safety look. So things have been different. From what I remember, last year they ran a lot more man coverage than they did in the last season under Ken Norton. So 2021, they were last in man coverage rates. And then the following year, they increased significantly. They were doing more dime looks in 2022. And obviously, the dime looks continued into the Rams game, albeit with very, very low success. So in terms of the scheme and the alignments, things have evolved over the years. Pete's not just been going out there running the same defense with this roster as he did with the Legion of Boom. But his philosophy on explosive plays and how to stop NFL offenses, that might be a slightly different story. The predictability that you may be referring to may be his approach to not getting beat over the top, allowing teams to go underneath and intermediates. In other words, if you're going to score on us, you're going to have to do it 13, 14 plays. Personally, I really dislike that idea because the Seahawks have already played 81 defensive snaps. They had the most snaps in 2020. They had the most snaps in 2021. I think they had the third most snaps in 2022. So they had some years in the Legion of Boom days where those 13 and 14 play drives, that's because those teams had to earn every yard. It was an absolute slog just to score on the Seahawks. But when it's easy 14, 15 play drives like the Rams had repeatedly and like other teams had the last several years, where there's very little resistance and running backs are wide open for checkdowns and the middle of the field is as open as it's ever been, then that's an issue that I think that Pete has not addressed particularly well over the past few years. And I do believe a good chunk of it is personnel. But we'll get to that a little later on with some other questions. So moving on to formerly known as Sounder at Heart or Sounders at Heart. Question, why do we continuously pass on players that everyone rates high and think we know better than the experts? Jalen Carter. Are we going to do this every week? And I don't mean to pick on you, but it seems like because of the lack of pass rush for the Seahawks and the fact that Devin Witherspoon hasn't played a snap yet, Jalen Carter is just going to be on the minds of a lot of Seahawks fans because he was available at pick 5. A lot of mock draft analysts and a lot of fans expected that the Seahawks would pick Carter because of the deficiency and the interior of the defensive line. It was totally logical, but of course, Carter had his court case. There were questions about his character that Todd McShay brought up, and he slipped a little bit. He went to the Philadelphia Eagles, and he had a pretty good debut by all accounts, based on the film, and the statistics seem to back that up. But are we not a year removed from the Seahawks taking Charles Cross at number 9 overall? Or just this year, the Seahawks took Jackson Smith-Njigba, the first receiver, off the board. There has been a shift in the draft philosophy back to taking the best player available or one of the best players available. And what's amusing to me is, yes, the Seahawks pass rush was dismal against the Rams. But the problem with the secondary, the players not named Tariq Woolen or Reek Woolen, I should note, that kind of justify why they took Witherspoon in the first place because the performances of Trey Brown and Mike Jackson were not the best. And of course, Kobe Bryant struggled again playing as the starting nickel. So you can understand why the Seahawks wanted to get Witherspoon because the secondary, even acknowledging that Witherspoon was out and then Adams is not back yet, it may not be as good as we think it really should be. We know Woolen is very good, and he's got the potential to be an All-Pro corner. We know that Quandre Diggs has been one of the top safeties in the league, top ball hawks. He probably didn't play his best on Sunday, but everything else is a bit of a wild card. And we're expecting the potential of Trey Brown or even Mike Jackson Sr. to elevate to a level of being a really good cornerback. But that hasn't materialized yet. Whereas Witherspoon, there is quite a bit of hope that he can be another shutdown aggressive corner so that you have two shutdown aggressive corners as opposed to you don't throw Woolen's way, so you just attack everybody else. And that's pretty much what we saw with Matthew Stafford on Sunday. And even Woolen got beat a couple times. There was one throw to Puka Nacua that probably should have been a touchdown, but Stafford overthrew him. But yes, the Jalen Carter discourse is going to be nauseating because with each week, the Seahawks defense doesn't show any semblance of a pass rush, whether from its edge rushers or the interior. And Carter keeps balling out for the Eagles. It's just going to look so glaring. Now, I would say that if Witherspoon didn't go to the Seahawks, then the Lions probably would have taken him next based on what was written by Albert Breer, Sports Illustrated, on the behind the scenes look at the Detroit draft room. So it wasn't like Witherspoon was just going to have some sort of big slide. He wasn't overdrafted based on the consensus opinion of him as the top corner in the draft. But yes, the Seahawks really, really need some help on the interior. And maybe Carter would have helped, but the counterpoint to that is the Philadelphia Eagles have such a deep defense. They're just more talented. They lost Javon Hargrave, sure, but they still have Brandon Graham. They still have Hassan Reddick. It's just a better, well more organized defense than what the Seahawks have. So even if the Seahawks had drafted Carter with the talent on this defensive line, you may get different results. Whereas with the Eagles, you got to deal with Reddick, you got to deal with Fletcher Cox, you got to deal with so many guys that it makes life a little bit easier for Jalen Carter to succeed right out of the gate in Philadelphia, as opposed to had he been drafted with the Seahawks. So that's just something to think about. And yeah, like I said earlier, they're not continuously passing on players and overthinking it in the draft. They certainly were guilty of it in previous drafts, but I don't think that was the case for this year or the previous year. All right, so let's move on to ham time. Should I be happy that this is just the first game of the season, or should I be worried that this is just the first game of what is looking like a very long season? So if there's a little bit of comfort, and I'm recording this early Tuesday, so the Bills-Jets game obviously ended Monday night. Half of the teams that made the playoffs last year ended up losing week one, and that includes the Chiefs and the Bengals and the Bills, your consensus top three teams in the AFC. So you lose game one, it's not the end of the world. 0-2, you start to sweat a little bit, and even then, we just saw the Bengals almost make the Super Bowl again after an 0-2 start. 0-3 is probably unrecoverable even in a 17-game season. So there should be some level of concern with the Seahawks at the way they lost this game. Obviously, the season isn't over if they lose to Detroit, but if they go into the bye week 0-4, 1-3, even in a weakened-looking NFC, there might be reason to sound the alarm bells. But I think people are generally upset with the way that the Seahawks lost that game. If they had lost that game by 3, the typical nonsensical way to lose to the Rams, that would have been one thing. To go into halftime with a lead and then lose 23-0 in the second half and put up 12 yards of offense, 9 of which came on the last play of the game when it was just running out the clock. Yes, that's going to upset a lot of people. And again, it's not just the fact that they got blown out. It's that the defense, which we hoped would be significantly improved or at least marginally improved, they weren't there from the opening snap. I mean, they started the season giving up a 15-play touchdown drive or a 16-play touchdown drive. And that is just a continuation of what we've been seeing over the past few seasons. And then you add on the offense not being able to do anything in the second half, plus you lose Cross and Lucas and then briefly Tyler Lockett. And that felt like one of the worst potential ways that the Seahawks could have lost that game to the Rams. Now, should credit the Rams with the fact that Matthew Stafford looked really on point. He looks sharp. And that's the difference when you're playing Matthew Stafford and not John Wolford or Baker Mayfield or a lot of the backup quarterbacks that the Seahawks were playing towards the end of last season that the defense looked quote unquote better against. Against starting quarterbacks, we're looking at almost a full year since they've last beaten a team that was actually playing its QB1. And Stafford can still sling it, and Nakua obviously might be one to watch. I don't know if that was a one-game wonder thing like John Ross a few years ago, but there was a lot of raving about him in the preseason, and he was making some genuinely impressive plays that probably no defense could have done anything about. So now we get to Zach Venturo. So today I wanted to see, and of course this was written on Sunday, so I wanted to see a ballsy gunslinger like Locke. Will we this season? And do you think Pete will impede that possibility because it would mean taking a little more risk with the ball? Where did all the Drew Lock clamoring come from this quickly? I don't understand. I guess this is what I was concerned about, the fact that Locke actually looked decent in the preseason, that because of the way Geno kind of drifted a bit towards regressing to the mean at the end of last season, that if Locke looked better than he did the previous preseason and Geno struggled even one time, there would be calls for a quarterback switch. I don't think that's warranted. Now, don't get me wrong, Geno didn't play well, but the whole team just was not up to par for most of the day. But the only way we see Locke to me is if Geno gets hurt, and hopefully that doesn't happen, or if this, well, three ways. Geno gets hurt, which we hope doesn't happen. The second bit is if it's blowout time one way or another, and it's time to play out the string, and then Locke comes in. And then the third option would be this season is pretty much in the tank. They're way out of playoff contention. Geno is having more performances like he did against the Rams. And then Pete is pressed into making a quarterback change just to do anything to liven up the offense. I think we got to be wary about preseason play, positive preseason play against second and third and fourth stringers. So Locke showed some good things, definitely with play action. But that Packers game, I thought he was worse than his stats suggested, and he got away with a pick six and probably a couple other risky throws. And against first stringers and him wanting to be a gunslinger, yeah, that's going to irritate Pete if those become interceptions or dangerous throws on a loop. So with Locke, my issue with him is what's going to happen when he's put into obvious passing situations? What's going to happen when he's faced with a blitz, and how is he going to respond to certain scenarios that Geno showed that he can succeed? We saw it last year. We saw him throw the deep ball really well, and that was one of the arguments in favor of starting Locke over Geno, is that Locke has got this great arm, and he'll be able to push the ball downfield more. Well, Geno is one of the top deep threats as far as his quarterbacks last season, so that's a non-issue. And then for Locke, his accuracy was certainly a problem in Denver. It didn't look that way in preseason, but again, it is preseason. It is against guys who are probably not in the league right now or are not starters. So these are starters. It is going to be a schedule that includes defenses like Philadelphia and Dallas. Do you really want to put Locke in those situations? I'm not sure. I think that Geno can get back on track. It was an ugly game, no doubt, and certainly he's going to need his offensive tackles, but those things might be correctable. But I don't think we're in start Drew Lock mode already. I mean, it's that bit is one game and an overreaction to me. Lock may be better than I think he is, but this clamoring for him feels a bit unfair to Geno after the season that he had, and just having this off day on a day when nobody really played well. So yeah, I don't think we're going to see Lock anytime soon unless absolutely press into it. So Seattle sports fan 85, today was a bad loss, no doubt about that. But how come every time we have a loss, the Seahawks and Seattle fans always assume the worst? Could this be a long and bad season? Sure, but a long way to go. People will fan how they want to fan, but who do Seattle fans especially, or I guess why do Seattle fans especially get so morose after a loss? I don't know if they get so morose after a loss, but I will say I think the attitude among Seahawks fans in general changed after the Patriots Super Bowl, and there's no way around it. If you think otherwise, then you're in pure denial. Two Super Bowls back to back for the Seahawks, and I think we could have accepted the end of an era or whatever, with moving on from Wilson, all that stuff, and say, hey, one of the few teams to get two Super Bowls in league history, one of the few teams to go back to back, all that good stuff. But instead, it's left wanting more. that the Seahawks, that looked like the next dynasty, the next great dynasty, only got one Super Bowl, was a yard away from getting a second Super Bowl and haven't come particularly close since then. So the second bit there, me saying they haven't come particularly close since then, they haven't made the NFC Championship game, and they haven't been all that close to making it to the NFC Championship game. And in more recent times, um, let's be serious, the Seahawks have lost quite a bit since 2020, the let Russ cook season, in which they went 12-4 and they got humiliated by the Rams in the wild card round. 7-10 in 2021, 9-8 in 2022, plus the wild card loss to the 49ers. Now 0-1 to start this season. So you do the math, and the Seahawks are 16-20 in their last 36 games. That is a far cry from the perennial winning records that we got from 2012 through 2020. So we've been seeing a lot of losing, and I think that with Pete in particular, it's the way that they're losing, which means that the defense is continuing to struggle. The offense is struggling to generate easy plays. They're struggling to do anything that isn't off of an explosive play. The pass protection is an issue. The run blocking, which I thought was solid for the most part, kind of dissipated in the second half, and then you have to deal with the injuries and the annoyance that when the Seahawks seem to have injuries, they respond a lot worse than when they're playing teams that are dealing with injuries like the Rams and not having Cooper Kupp. So I don't think Seahawks fans as a whole always just go into chicken little mode after a loss. But with all the great expectations of this season compared to last season, where it felt like the Seahawks, if they were just exciting to watch as a 6-11 team, we could have accepted that. But because they performed above expectations and then had this draft and then made a couple of decent free agent signings or enticing free agent signings, the belief would be, hey, can this team make a run, deep playoff run? Can they win the NFC West? And then they come out and fall flat on their faces at home. And that's another thing, too, that the Seahawks are, I believe they're sub 500 at home since 2021. So that home field advantage is just a shell of itself. And I don't blame the crowd. I don't blame the types of fans that are at the stadium. The crowd was amped up from the start. Just listen to the ovation Bobby Wagner got in pregame. That was pregame. And just listen to the roar from the Broncos game last year. I don't think it's a case of the crowd is not as loud as it used to be. I think it's more of when the team is not as good as it used to be, then home field advantage tends to matter a little bit less. Next up, Go Hawks from Albuquerque. What is it going to take to stop hemorrhaging yards over the middle? Better linebacker play. And I say that semi-facetiously, but I think the linebacker play has to play a role, whether it was Brooks and Barton over the last year or so, or whether it's Bobby Wagner in 2023 or 2021. Wagner had 18 or 19 tackles, but when he's involved in the middle of the field and not able to go downhill and make some run stops, teams are probably going to be picking on that middle of the field until further notice. If you look at the Matthew Stafford passing chart from Next Gen Stats, I think he was something like 12 of 14 for 100 some odd yards. He was just absolutely torching the Seahawks in the middle of the field, particularly in areas where Wagner would be responsible for some form of coverage. Not every time, but certainly on several of those plays. And maybe the other aspect of Pete Carroll's defensive philosophy is that they're way too willing to concede those routes. I mean, look at their DVOA when they are defending plays against running backs and tight ends. It tends to be dismal, or at least in more recent seasons, it's been dismal. What was so frustrating about this Sunday game was they got beat every which way, other than, I guess, checkdowns. They were getting beat intermediate, and they were getting beat over the top. They gave up a deep pass to Tutu Atwell that Trey Brown pretty much ran into his own guy. It was a self-pick and roll in a bunch formation. And then Van Jefferson just snuck behind the defense. He got wide open and dropped it, and it should have been a touchdown. But I feel like the Seahawks are a little bit too willing to sell out on stopping deep passes, and they are just leaving these giant voids in the middle of the field where Stafford definitely made some great throws into tight windows, but other times Rams receivers are just getting wide open out of the break, or Rams targets are getting wide open out of the break, and that just can't keep happening. Will it be happening over the entirety of the season? I'd like to think that won't be the case and that the coaches are allowed to make adjustments and that the players will improve. But we've kind of seen this story before, haven't we? Where at least since 2018, I'd say really 2019, the Seahawks start the first few weeks of the season where it looks like they'd never practiced together on defense. And then at some point in the middle of the year, things start to improve. They normally play inferior quarterbacks and then shut them down, and then we all get all chesty and say, "All right, the Seahawks defense is fixed," and then we're back to reality with 1 or 2 games left in the season, and then it all falls apart. So that they started it this way was kind of worst case scenario because look at the Lions offense. If you think the Seahawks pass rush struggled against the Rams, and the reworked offensive line with a rookie left guard and Alaric Jackson at left tackle and Joe Noteboom going from right tackle to right guard. The Lions offensive line is one of the tops in the league. You got Penei Sewell, Taylor Decker, I think is injured, but still, that is a really good pass protecting unit, and they're really good at run blocking as well. So the pass rush is going to have its hands full against that Lions offensive line, which means you're asking the secondary and the linebackers to cover a lot better. And as we saw in the Rams game, the early returns were not promising. Let's put it that way. Chancelled, great username. It's hard not to feel deflated after that loss. What jumps out to me is how open their receivers were and how many of our catches were contested. We have Lockett, DK, JSN, Bobo, Disley, you get the rest, and depth behind them. Is it really a talent issue? I'm less certain about talent on defense, but there's some really bright players like Woolen and Bobby out there. Why does our offense make everything look difficult and contested while our defense makes it look easy? I want to think it's just one game, but it feels more systemic than that. Hopefully, it's just the start of new players learning how to work as a team and the talent overcome any scheme deficiencies. Yes, the Rams receivers were open a hell of a lot. And then on offense, at least for this game, and Matty F. Brown does a much better job at analyzing film than I could ever dream of. But from just rewatching bits of the TV broadcast and not the all 22, the receivers were not getting open. They were just getting shut down with relative ease, almost as if Raheem Morris knew exactly what the Seahawks were going to do. So we know that McVay and Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel, they are experts at scheming receivers open. Shane Waldron, I think, generally does a good job more often than not, but on this occasion, I was disappointed with the way that the play calling worked itself out. There were some creative things I saw with the 12 personnel and lining up 2 tight ends in the backfield and all that noise, but the under center play action disappeared. Hardly any bootlegs. It was a bizarrely called game to do so much straight drop back passing in a game that didn't get out of hand until the fourth quarter. So Waldron's certainly got to do better, and the players certainly have to execute better. But if we are to assume that Pete Carroll really just has his hands meddled in the offense and defense and everything possible, it's no secret that in the Russell Wilson years, they didn't attack the middle of the field all that often. And for what it's worth, in Denver in his first season, Wilson still didn't really attack the middle of the field all that much. But what gets lost is that Geno's rate of attacking the middle of the field was not that much higher than Russell Wilson, from what I recall. I'm wondering if it is a Carroll philosophy that it's safer to do throws along the sidelines as opposed to the middle of the field where, at least from his perspective, dangerous things can happen. Tip passes, roving linebacker or roving safety is going to jump the route and something crazy can happen. You can get it picked off. I just wish that the Seahawks would have a much different approach on defense. But let's be fair, the Legion of Boom was great at stopping the middle of the field. Don't think that the Phillip Rivers game in 2014, where he just kept throwing it to Danny Woodhead and Gates and Keenan Allen, was emblematic of the Seahawks defensive struggles for several years at a time. Not every team was capable of doing that. And that was when you had prime Bobby and prime KJ and prime Cam and prime Earl Thomas. But with players who are not as good as those players were, and that includes Bobby in 2023 not being as good as Bobby of 2013 or 2014, it can be a lot harder to pull off what you want to pull off as far as what you want to stop. So I don't understand how the Seahawks struggled to have receivers open throughout this game, which is why I think Geno, as much as he struggled, it was not entirely on him. There were just not enough open targets for him to throw to. But I'd like to think that this can get corrected with scheming easier throws, sort of like what we saw a lot from the beginning of last season. All that boot action, throwing it to Will Dissly or Noah Fant or Colby Parkinson. What we ended up seeing is that Fant didn't even get targeted. He was a spectator as a receiving target, and that's not what you want to see out of your fifth-year option, first-round pick and presumptive tight end one. We saw the screen passes, which were again a complete disaster. I don't know what else to say as far as that, or if it's ever fixable with this coaching staff. That their screen passes don't gain a lot of yards, and the Seahawks can't seem to stop screen passes all that well. But something clearly has to change philosophically about how they view the passing game. That things got to open up for receivers to be open at all levels of the field, whether it's down the field, intermediate, or check down. It feels like certainly a lot of those third down passes that Gino was making, the route combinations were uninspired and pretty predictable. Whereas with Stafford and the Rams, they were just getting the Seahawks every which way. They had them running in circles and they didn't know what to cover. So I guess that's the difference between having an elite play caller, elite schemer in Sean McVay, and having the Seahawks coaching staff, which is not terrible, but I would not put them in the upper echelon as far as scheming up great offense, great passing offense, more specifically, compared to McVay or Kyle Shanahan or Mike McDaniel or Andy Reid, et cetera, et cetera. Soundhawk says, will you come to my house and hit me in the head with a baseball bat so I forget the last 24 hours? I'm not willing to commit a felony, even though you gave me consent, but thanks for asking. That's so polite. Next up, Hawk McCracken the 12th. I was hoping the secondary could cover and provide time for the pass rush to get home. With such high expectations coming into the season for the secondary, what happened? And will Spoon and Adams becoming healthy and seeing the field make any difference? I think Spoon becoming healthy will make a difference. I'm not sure if Adams really has much to offer in terms of his peak physical condition, because that's going to be so important to determining whether he has anything left. I mean, back to back to back serious injuries, the torn labrums and now the quad rupture. I know he's still in his mid 20s, but for somebody who plays as physically as he does, it would be extremely impressive if he was to recapture any of his golden form, which would mean his success as a blitzer and his play speed being one of the best in the league. But I'm reminded of Bob Sanders. I'm not saying Jamal Adams is Bob Sanders, but like prime Bob Sanders was a damn good safety for the Colts, and he made a huge difference in their Super Bowl run back in 2006. But he couldn't stay healthy, and he eventually became a shell of himself pretty young. I hope that's not the case for Adams, but that's what I fear. With Witherspoon, I think one of the things the Seahawks would do is make Brian a healthy scratch or limit him to special teams, because it is so hard to run the defense that they want to run when Bryant doesn't seem to have the athleticism to stay with receivers in the slot. And the tackling issues that were plaguing him in his rookie year continued into this game. So he's definitely a willing blitzer, and maybe that's one of his strengths. But the forced fumbles that we saw in his rookie year kind of masked the rest of his actual performance. So the forced fumbles were cool. They were definitely big turnovers for the Seahawks in the games that they played. But him getting beaten or him losing his man or him not making good tackles or taking good angles, I think Witherspoon would be an upgrade there. And not having Bryant and having Witherspoon there should improve the secondary in theory. But when Witherspoon hasn't practiced for a month, you're going to expect some rust and you're going to expect some coverage mix-up. So it's not going to be instantaneous for Adams. Obviously, the lack of a pass rush, you would think that Adams would be going in on blitzes, maybe not at the rate that Norton had him doing it in 2020. But that's kind of an example of where I would push back to the first question about Pete Carroll just running the same thing over and over again. There's not a Cam and Earl were not blitzing at the rate that Adams was blitzing. And if Pete was still going to run the same defense, I don't think he would have ever traded for Adams because he has his versatility and you can match him everywhere. But with Cam and Earl and everybody else, they kind of had more defined roles as opposed to this amoeba-like form. We see it with the Chargers and Derwin James. And I noticed Chargers fans are pretty upset with the way that Derwin James was used in the loss to the Dolphins. And I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but maybe it's time to reevaluate the value of being a versatile secondary player or a versatile defensive player. Because look at Isaiah Simmons. He just got traded from the Cardinals over to the Giants. They were playing him at every position possible. They were playing him at linebacker. They were playing him at edge. Sometimes they were playing him at safety or slot corner. And nothing really stuck. and now he's in New York, and we'll see if his career can be revived. But you look at Derwin James, and he's kind of in that Adams mold of, wow, you can play him on all these positions. How much does that actually matter? The offense dictates the terms of matchups, not really the other way around. So, but anyway, getting back to Jamal Adams, certainly Julian Love didn't cover himself in glory in his debut, but just having Adams and Witherspoon back over the next few weeks would probably reduce the roles of guys like Love and Bryant, who were definitely not the top performers over the course of the opening day. So, how many more questions we got here? All right, this is the last question. Wagwan, is this commenter Jamaican? I gotta know. Wagwan. Anyway, how far away are we from being in San Francisco's league? Oh, yes, this is the last question, and I'm very much looking forward to answering it because I know that I picked the Seahawks to make the playoffs but not win the division. Some of our staff picked the Seahawks to win the division and make a Super Bowl run or at least win a couple playoff games, and some of our own commenters believe that they could topple San Francisco. Maybe they still can, of course. It's just 1 week. But in terms of being in San Francisco's league, in terms of being close to the 49ers, and I know there were some quotes over the offseason that the gap was closing between the Seahawks and the 49ers. That remains to be seen. But what the Seahawks have, in more practical terms, they have young talent that is not proven yet, and they're not established as top players in the league just yet. In other words, Reek Woolen, awesome player. I wouldn't call him the best corner in the league already or a top 3 corner just yet. Kenneth Walker, 1,000-yard rusher in his rookie season. That's what missing the first few games. Would not call him a top 5 running back just yet. Or Charles Cross, a top 10 tackle. Same with Abraham Lucas. The potential is there for them to be elite players. The 49ers have established elite players. You cannot say with a straight face that you would take Charles Cross over Trent Williams, for example. You might do that in a few years' time because by then Trent will be retired or in severe decline. But Trent Williams, for now, future Hall of Fame left tackle, outstanding at his job still. Christian McCaffrey, the most complete running back in the league. And I don't think you could argue for anybody else at this point. He is an elite running back. And the Seahawks don't have an elite running back just yet. Ken Walker has the potential to be there, but he's not right now. McCaffrey is just a phenomenal player, and Kyle Shanahan knows how to use him right. George Kittle, I wouldn't take any of Seattle's tight ends, none of Fant, Disley, or Parkinson over George Kittle. And he's not racking up big catching numbers like Travis Kelce would, but he has such value as a blocker in addition to what he does as a receiver that he is a perennial top 5 tight end. You look at Deebo Samuel. Yes, Samuel, I think, is a better receiver than most of the Seahawks roster. And of course, there's the versatility on offense, which I think means a lot more than versatility on defense, where you could play him at running back, you could play him at wide receiver, and he's still a danger everywhere. And he certainly breaks a lot more tackles than anybody on the Seahawks roster right now. Brandon Ayuk is emerging as at least legit top number 2 receiver. So you have Samuel and Ayuk, and that could be one of the best receiving duos in the league. Now, the Seahawks, I think, have one of the top receiving duos in the league in Metcalf and Lockett. They don't have one of the top receiving trios yet because Smith-Njigba has played all of one game. But that was just the offensive side of the ball that I listed there with San Francisco, where you have a top 10, 15, or whatever receiving duo in Samuel and Ayuk. You have a top 3, maybe the number 1 running back in McCaffrey, maybe the number 1 left tackle in Trent Williams, top 5 tight end in George Kittle. The Seahawks don't have any of that on offense. Not yet. And I emphasize not yet. And then you get to the defense. You have Nick Bosa. Uchenna Nwosu is cool and all. He is not in Nick Bosa's league. One of the top pass rushers in the league. You go to Fred Warner. Fred Warner, I love watching him play. Again, probably the top linebacker in the league. I don't want to be that declarative, but certainly among the best. I don't really care about Bobby Wagner's PFF grade from 2022. I know that Bobby Wagner is not who he used to be. And Fred Warner is a better linebacker than him at this stage of their respective careers. And for that matter, Jordan Brooks is a good linebacker. I would put Fred Warner over him too. And then Dre Greenlaw is a good complementary linebacker as well. Hufanga, underrated safety to me, and he's certainly a fun player to watch. The corners, I guess Mooney Ward would be where you could say maybe Woolen is right there with him, but overall, the coaching of the 49ers defense just looks so much more organized than what we see out of Seattle, such that they could go to Pittsburgh in a 10 a.m. game and just completely shut them down and hold them to no first downs almost until halftime. So just the roster comparison, it's not close right now. It is not close. The Seahawks are riding a lot on potential, and I guess that would include Geno Smith and what he could potentially do over these next few seasons as quarterback. But the 49ers already have established elite talent. That's why they made the NFC Championship game over the last 2 seasons. And if Brock Purdy is any good, then it's kind of the worst case scenario for Seahawks fans. If he's any good and he's healthy, because Kyle Shanahan, much like Mike Martz back in the day, it seems that his systems, as brilliant as they are ripe for quarterbacks just getting hurt. But if he's any good, if he's better than Garoppolo and better than Trey Lance, if he is their true franchise quarterback, then the 49ers, pending, of course, salary cap issues, are well positioned to contend for at least another couple of seasons. They just have better established talent. The Seahawks have promising talent, but not a lot of established top five at their position talent. Quandre Diggs, I guess, would be one example where you could say the Seahawks have got a more reputable safety group than San Francisco does. But at every other position I've just listed, from left tackle to running back to wide receiver to tight end, you name it, 49ers are better for a reason. So doesn't mean that the Seahawks are never going to get there, but they still have a ways to go. And it was exemplified in the way that last year's games went, where they got essentially shut out in week 2, pretty much not competitive in the home game on Thursday night, where they got a touchdown, but it was too late and they scored 13 points. And then their best game was incredibly the playoff game, but it was only for a half. And then they just got absolutely thrashed in the second half and got no stops whatsoever. So we may despise the 49ers, but we have to acknowledge they've got a much better roster at the moment than the Seahawks. So that could change in a couple of years when notable players from the 49ers leave and some of these Seahawks young talents get better. But in the meantime, San Francisco is a Super Bowl contender for a reason, and the Seahawks are considered a dark horse for a reason. The 49ers have got the success that the Seahawks really have not had over the last few years. So just something to keep in mind, as sobering as that may be, San Francisco is just better. All right. So on that note, again, thank you for all of your questions. I wish I could get to more, but I don't want to go on an hour and a half answering all the questions. And I certainly noticed there were a lot of side discussions within the comment section that were quite entertaining to read. So you can follow me on Twitter at Mookie Alexander and on the Field Goals account at Field Goals. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. This is our third iteration of the Field Goals YouTube channel. I'll have more videos like these in the weeks to come. And then, of course, we'll have more great content over at fieldgoals.com. Been wanting to do an enemy reaction, but obviously the Rams pretty much made that moot. But we will have game previews of the Lions matchup coming soon and other injury updates and all that good stuff. So until next time, take care, everyone.